In this video, I'm going to show you how I created the corridor in 10 hours using Unreal Engine 4. This video is an overview of the entire workflow process, and I will cover hour by hour of what I did to achieve the final result. Now, the hour by hour structure is a framework, and each hour of the workflow is focused on one aspect of production. This video covers a lot of insight and process development steps, but if you want to follow a step-by-step, hour-by-hour breakdown and learn all the specific techniques of what it took to create the corridor, then I highly recommend that you take a look at Unreal Engine 4 The Corridor Project. This premium tutorial series contains 4 hours of video tutorials and a step-by-step workflow of how the corridor was constructed. So let's begin with the making of the corridor. First thing I do before I work on any project is that I spend time figuring out of what I'm going to do. So I write up an outline and create a plan of action for the next 10 hours. The idea for this environment is to create an office building floor using existing static meshes and only focusing on a small section of the corridor or the hallway. A few constraints that I gave myself is this is a standalone game environment. That means it will not include any gameplay, and it will be constructed using a custom set of static meshes. Now, these static meshes were created ahead of time, so these custom assets are not part of the 10-hour process, and I created them before I began constructing this environment. And of course, the other constraint is the time frame. I gave myself 10 hours to complete this environment. It's always a good idea when you set a project to outline what you will and will not do and come up with a list of self-imposed limitations or constraints for the project and then work within them to create your environment. So once I had the idea and a list of what will be created, the next step is I collected reference of various locations of office buildings, modern interiors, buildings lobbies, and corridor and hallways. You should always collect photo reference for any idea and any project that you work on. Photo reference helps you to understand exactly what you're going to create. And I never work on any environment unless I've collected sufficient reference. I then continue to create a top-down layout. Even though this is a very small environment, I still sketch a quick top-down layout of what I am going to build. Now, with the preliminaries out of the way, I start with the very first hour, and that is project and editor setup. This first hour is probably the shortest out of all the 10 hours, and I start by opening up the launcher and creating a new project. I use a blank game template. I then choose desktop and console, maximum quality, and I choose to not include any starter content. I want to have a completely empty project. I then name the project and create it. For editor setup, there are 2 things that I usually do when I start a new project. First is I disable real time to speed up the workflow in the viewport, and I go to editor preferences and disable autosave. As I've mentioned in other videos, this is a personal preference, and many like to use this option, but I like to manually save my maps and content, and I don't want to rely on something automatic to do it for me. I then go to File, New Level, and create a default new level. Now, the reason I use a default level and not a blank level is due to already included actors, such as atmospheric fog, directional light, and player start. It saves me a bit of time to have these actors already set up, so I don't have to include them myself. But later on, I do delete these actors and set them up myself. But to get things moving into the blocking process, I use a default level to get myself started quicker. With the default level, I go ahead and save the map as the corridor 01 BSP. This is the naming convention I usually use, and it's the name of the level, then version number, and what I am working on in that level. I copy and paste the corridor assets into the project's content folder. I have 3 folders: static meshes, textures, and materials. And these are the 3 folders that get copied and pasted into the content folder. And if I look into the content browser, these 3 folders automatically show up. And with that, I am ready to go into hour 2, and that is BSP block-in. BSP brush block-in is used to prototype and create a layout for your environments without having to be distracted on the visuals and the details. So during the BSP block-in stage, I am focused on judging scale, proportion, and defining the overall layout of the level. I am not using any static meshes and only BSP brushes. And for the corridor project, I start off by inserting a ground plane. Then once I have that, I insert a skeletal mesh, and this helps me to judge scale. And I insert the skeletal mesh in every single project I create. You always want to reference your construction of the level to a player character in-game. So you always want to insert something that helps you reference as you create your game environments. Now the corridor isn't going to be playable, but it's still important to construct your game environments to human reference scale. I followed the sketch and I tried to capture the essence of the layout. So I begin with the ground plane and I start off with the focal point, which is the corridor itself. I estimate the size and the width of the corridor that I want, and then I expand to include the walls. Once I've inserted the ground plane, I usually duplicate that BSP brush and include it for the wall, for the ceiling. So instead of coming back up to place mode and redragging a BSP box, I just duplicate already existing brushes. This helps me to speed up the workflow. So once I have the general dimensions of the corridor done, including the ceiling, I insert another BSP box and I change it to subtractive. And I estimate the size of the windows that I would want, and then I duplicate that subtractive brush along the entire corridor. Now the actual design of the windows is going to be dependent on the static mesh, but the entire BSP workflow is just to gauge the space and overall layout. So I'm not designing at this point, I'm just trying to block in the overall layout. Once I'm happy with the dimensions of the corridor, I expand to the side hallways. I include the stairs that will go up to the 2nd floor, and I create just a bit of the 2nd floor, just to give enough illusion that there is more to this environment than the focal point of the corridor. I also include BSP columns to help me judge how I would break up the flatness of each wall, but I am trying to keep this entire layout as simple as possible. So I'm using BSP shapes that are very simple, and I'm not adding any detail, just enough to get my brain working of what I would want to include, but everything else is going to be added in terms of detail using static meshes. And the last part of the process, I jump inside the game and I play test it from the player's point of view, even though we won't have a player in here and this is not a playable space. I'm still treating it as it is a playable space. For hour 3, my goal is to replace all of the BSP brushes with static meshes. Now you may wonder, why didn't I just insert static meshes to begin with and avoid the entire BSP block-in process? And that's because during BSP block-in, I am only focused on the layout. I'm not focused on any detailing or trying to create an actual environment. With BSP brushes, it's all about proportion, layout, and scale. Also, if this was a playable level, I would playtest and script gameplay mechanics of the level. And with BSP brushes, I can iterate and change very quickly. If I begin to include static meshes right away, then I'm actually designing the environment, and I would get too focused on trying to detail way too soon before I had the skeleton of the level completed. So I begin with the floor. I insert floor static meshes and I duplicate them all the way along the corridor. And then once I do that, I get rid of the BSP brush. Staying on the grid in both the BSP process and when you static meshing is very important. So I make sure that I am snapping to the grid as I'm duplicating all of the static meshes. I then include the walls and I add the columns. And then as I do that, I delete the BSP brushes behind it. The alignment of these BSP brushes is very important. So I can't stress enough that you make sure that everything is being snapped to the grid and to each other. So every static mesh is being aligned and snapped as you construct your environments. So I duplicate the walls all the way along, include the columns, and then I jump over to the other side and I do the same thing for the windows. I focus on making sure that one section of the windows looks the way I want it to, and then I grab all the static meshes, the columns and the wall and the windows, and then I duplicate them along the entire corridor. So I basically construct one part and one combination of static meshes, and then once I like how it looks, I repeat it along the entire section of the map. I then move on to continue the walls along the side hallways going up the stairs, and then I add the ceiling to close off the space. And with each new section and new static mesh framework inserted and completed, the BSP brushes get removed as I move along. So in the end of this process, I end up with absolutely no BSP brushes in this environment. Once I have the entire framework, all of the walls, windows, ceiling and floor inserted, I add a few additional elements such as a few columns along the floor next to the windows. This also helps to begin to design and break up some of the flat spaces along the ceiling, just as we did when we inserted columns being repeated along the corridor next to the walls. I constantly check that I included absolutely no gaps in the geometry between static meshes. And when I do all of the final fly-throughs and check that everything has been blocked off, I move on to hour 4. With hour 3, I focused on major architectural elements. These included floors, walls, ceiling, the structure of this corridor. And with hour 4, I'm focused on minor static meshes. And this includes tweaking scaling of certain static meshes in the environment, adding door frames, pots, plants, paintings, AC vents, and light strips. So this is pretty much adding decorative minor static meshes. So there's some time spent on making sure that all of the light strips line up and align to the columns, and these light strips also not just minor static mesh detail, they will serve a function. There'll be emissive light strips that will contribute to lighting this environment. So in this entire detailing pass, there's a lot of moving around and just tweaking of additional static meshes to make sure that everything fits into this environment and expands on the framework of the structural static meshes. Another detail pass I do is to insert decals. These decals include dirt decals on the walls, on the floor, and numbered decals. And decals are a great way to add additional detail and to break up the repetition of the same static mesh across the environment. So I can add a little bit of dirt to one section of the environment but not to the other. Same thing with numbers. I can add a decal number onto one wall and it makes that one wall to stand out. So the entire environment seems unique. And it's one problem that you may run into when you use modular static meshes, is that when you repeat these static meshes long enough, the eye begins to recognize these repeating elements in the environment, and you know that all of these static meshes are the same. But with adding decals, it helps to make some of these static meshes and the environment unique. And with that, I move on to hour 5. Hour 5 is pre-lighting prep. In this hour, the purpose is to make the environment ready to be lit for hour 6 and 7. So I start off by inserting a light mass importance volume, and I surround the entire level inside this volume. Light mass importance volume helps to define an area within the environment where you want to focus your lighting calculations. Every environment you create should include a light mass importance volume, and you should surround the important areas of your environment inside that volume. Then I focus on eye adaptation and outer exposure. For this, I need to insert post-process volume. And after I insert that volume, I set it to unbound, means that this post-process is universal across the entire level. Usually you would have to be inside that post-process to see the settings change, but when you check unbound, it becomes universal volume for the entire level. Eye adaptation and outer exposure controls a natural way of how your eyes react to when you walk in from a light environment into a dark environment, and vice versa. So when you walk in from exterior into a dark room, it takes a bit of time for your eyes to adjust in order for you to see inside that dark room. And that's what outer exposure and eye adaptation does inside the Unreal Engine. It mimics that behavior. So after I've inserted light mass importance volume and post-process, I insert a sphere reflection capture. This will help the environment to render accurate material reflections. Usually you would insert a sphere reflection capture for important areas throughout your environment. But in this case, this is a very small game space, so I only insert one. And if I need to insert more, I will do so later on. But one should be enough. Then I go through the entire environment and I block off possible light leaks. So anywhere where there are two static meshes meet and there might be some light bleed, I just block those areas off to make sure that everything is dark and the only light that comes in is through the windows. And for the last few steps, I delete the default actors that came with the default level. So that includes a skybox, directional light, and atmospheric fog. So essentially all I have left is a dark level and includes absolutely no lighting actors. When I focus on each lighting scenario later on, then I will reinsert the directional light and atmospheric fog. But in this pre-lighting prep, I want a completely dark environment so I can begin to light it. And with that, I build lighting, and I'm left with a completely dark level, with the exception of emissive light strips. In hour 6, I start with exterior lighting scenario. I insert a directional light, and this is going to be the sunlight for this environment. Now, before I light any environment, I spend a lot of time researching that lighting scenario. So I already have an idea of the time of day and the colors that I'm going to use. So after I insert a directional light, I make sure to position that light to shine through the windows, and I'm looking for interesting light and shadow pattern. Then I change light color and intensity. The time of day I'm going for is early afternoon, late morning. During this entire lighting process, there's a lot of rebuilding lights. So to see more accurate representation of how your lights look inside the level, I need to constantly rebuild lights. And I usually stick to preview at first, since it's the fastest way to rebuild lights. So after I change a few properties, I go up to in the main toolbar and rebuild. Once I'm fairly happy with light color and intensity for the environment, I go down into post-process and adjust outer exposure, the eye adaptation. I change the minimum and the maximum brightness. I set the minimum brightness at 0.1 and maximum brightness at 2. And I do not enable exposure. The next value I change is indirect lighting intensity. This gives me a little bit more illumination in darker areas of the corridor. I continuously rebuild lighting and compare the before and after. And as you rebuild lights and change properties, it becomes very difficult to tell what you're doing within the environment, if the values you're changing improving your environment or not. So one of the ways to monitor that is to take a screenshot before, then change a few values, rebuild lighting, and then take another screenshot, and then you compare before you change those values and after. And that is one of the ways that I constantly monitor if I'm moving in the right direction with the lighting. For the exterior lighting scenario, I first and only focus on the primary light source, which is the directional light, the sunlight. I make sure that I get this directional light looking as good as possible without inserting any additional secondary lights. And then once I'm happy with just the directional light, I move on into the corridor and I begin to add secondary lights. And in this case, the secondary lights are emissive light strips along the corridor. Now, emissive lights themselves don't give me a lot of control over how it's lighting the environment. So I insert point lights to simulate emissive light strips on the columns. And each point light gives me greater control over intensity, light color, and radius. So first I tweak that one point light, I change the color, intensity, and radius, and then I duplicate it along the entire corridor. I'm constantly rebuilding lights just as before, and I am comparing the before and after. The light color of the interior point lights is very important. Since the directional light is warm orange color, I make all of the point lights blue, so they're complementary to the main light source. I add more additional secondary lights next to the elevator, along the corridor, going up the stairs, and on the second floor. And then I add a couple of small spotlights for the exit sign. To finish up with this hour, I focus on atmosphere. First, I insert atmospheric fog. This gives me an illusion of having a skybox, and it also provides me with a sun disk that gets connected with the directional light. So now anytime I rotate a directional light, the atmospheric sun disk also updates. Atmospheric fog does add a bit of fog into the level, but for greater control I use exponential height fog. So I insert that into the level and I tweak a few properties to make exponential height fog work for this level. With that, I finish up the hour and I move on to hour 7, which is focusing on interior lighting scenario. Here I reopen a completely dark level that I set up in hour 5, and I begin all over again and I light this corridor for nighttime. So the approach to lighting this interior is a lot different than lighting for exterior. I do not use a directional light, and I only focus on point lights and spotlights as my primary lights. Now, just like for the exterior lighting scenario, I've spent time researching and looking at reference, and I have an idea of what I want this environment to look like. And then I insert a single point light and I tweak its properties to make it look as best as I can. Now I position this point light in front of the emissive light strip. The emissive light strip alone doesn't give me enough control to light this environment exactly how I want. So I use the emissive light strip and then I primarily tweak the point light to simulate that it's coming off from the emissive light strip. I change the color, intensity, and radius of that one single point light. And once I've rebuilt lighting, changed properties, and I like how that one single point light looks, I duplicate that point light across the entire corridor. And then I rebuild lights again. I continue to rebuild lights, change properties, and rebuild lights again, comparing the screenshots of before and after, and making sure that a series of these point lights light the corridor how I want it. So before I add any secondary lights, I just and only focus on these point lights. I then begin to expand the point lights up to the second floor, and I begin to add additional secondary point lights to help me light near the elevator, going up the hallway, on the stairs, For all of the secondary lights and all of the fill-in lights, I changed the mobility type to static, since inside Unreal you can't have any more than 4 overlapping stationary lights. So I keep all of the main primary lights as stationary and all the other lights are static. Once I'm done with primary lights and some of the fill-in lights, I decide to add more detailed lighting to balance out the corridor. Right now there's a lot of heavy lights on the right hand side on the columns, and it needs to be offset with something else on the left hand side. So I add additional strip lights next to the windows, and I insert additional fill-in lights to light along the window going down the corridor. For that I use point lights. They're all set to static and with very low intensity and low radius. Throughout this entire process, I build a lot of lighting, take screenshots before and after, and constantly compare if this environment is being lit exactly how I want it. I add more additional fill-in lights along the corridor, and I begin to finish up the lighting process by tweaking a few additional final lights, inserting exit spotlights, and inserting a directional light with extremely low intensity and a light color set to blue to simulate moonlight. The directional light is only there to give an illusion that the moonlight is coming through the windows, and it's a very minor and subtle detail. To finish up this hour, I add additional above the door lighting detail using emissive light strips, and additional lighting detail above the paintings. And with that, I'm ready to move on to hour 8. In hour 8, my focus is entirely on post-process for both interior and exterior lighting environments. I already have post-process inside the level for both of the lighting scenarios, and I begin to tweak various properties. In specific, I use a color grading technique, which allows me to tweak and change lighting using Photoshop. So the way it works is I take a screenshot in Unreal Engine, and then I open that screenshot in Photoshop. I change brightness and contrast, saturation, I adjust levels, basically adjusting the image exactly how I want it to look. I then save this information inside a color lookup table file, and then I use that file, import it into Unreal Engine, and plug it into color grading input. That information is then translated directly to light my scene exactly how I changed in Photoshop. It is one of my favorite techniques to use to change scene colors. I then finish up by changing a few additional properties inside the post-process volume, such as bloom, fringe intensity, vignette, and color grading intensity. Within the same hour, I then move on to interior lighting scenario, and I repeat the entire process, taking a screenshot, adjusting the screenshot levels, brightness, contrast, saturation, saving the color lookup table, and then importing it into Unreal Engine, then plugging that into color grading input, and updating the scene colors. So the changes applied from before and after are dramatic. And when I'm finished adjusting and tweaking all of the scene colors and the post-processing volume for both of the exterior and the interior lighting scenario, I move on to hour 9. In hour 9, I focus on changing world settings to build the environment on production lighting. At this stage, everything is done. All the geometry is completed, both environments have been lit, they've been detailed, and I'm only now focusing on building this environment on production lighting. My main focus here is to change and update world setting properties under light mass settings. Some of the properties that I change include number of indirect lighting bounces, indirect lighting quality, environment color, environment intensity, ambient occlusion, and so on. As I'm changing these properties, I take a screenshot before, I bake lighting, and I take a screenshot after, and I compare just like we did in hour 6 and 7 when we lit both of the environments. In this hour, I am now building everything on production quality. This takes the longest to render, but it gives me the best visual quality for this environment. So I am pretty much finishing this up and tweaking how this environment is rendered. I go through all of the world settings for the exterior lighting scenario, and I repeat this process for the interior lighting scenario. And when everything's done, I have two environments that have been rendered at production quality. And all of the world settings for light mass have been tweaked, which produces the best quality render for both of these environments. In the final 10th hour, I am entirely focused on creating something to show. I am creating a video fly-through for both of the environments, for the interior and the exterior lighting scenario, and I'm taking high-resolution screenshots. So essentially this environment is completed, and I am creating a video and grabbing screenshots to showcase work completed. To do a video fly-through, I do it entirely inside the editor. Unreal Engine allows you to create video fly-through by using Matinee, and then you can render out an AVI file of your fly-through. I use a 2-camera setup, and I cut from one camera to the other, which allows me to have a little variety of camera angles. And for screenshots, you can take high-resolution screenshots inside the editor as well. You simply spawn inside the level and enter a console command, high-res shot. And this will take a high-resolution screenshot for you to use. So once I'm done with the video and a screenshot, I am done with this environment. So the final result is one single environment that is lit two different ways. I hope you learned a lot in this workflow making of the corridor. This was an overview workflow of hour by hour and what it took to create the corridor. Now for you to follow a step-by-step process and every single technique along the way, I recommend that you take a look at Unreal Engine 4, the Corridor project. This is a premium tutorial series that will guide you through and show you exactly what you need to know so you can follow along and create the corridor yourself. This premium tutorial series also provides you with a custom set of static meshes that you saw in this video, so you can use these static meshes to follow along in this project. So take a look at the tutorial series, and I hope you enjoy this making of.